That Naturopathic Podcast. TNP.
Hello there.
Hi, and thanks for joining us. I'm Dr. Cara Denisio.
And I'm Dr. David Miller, and we hear your frustrations. This show is for you.
This show is for you if you're feeling like your current healthcare strategy is not getting to the root cause or the underlying reasons for your health.
This show is for you if you've been told that you're fine, but you definitely don't feel very well.
This show is for you if you're walking out of your doctor's office with 1, 2, 3, 4, or even 5 medications without any mention of diet, lifestyle, or a long-term game plan.
This show is for you if you've got several specialists taking care of you, but no one is really putting it all together.
This show is for you if you believe that health should be part of healthcare. These problems have solutions.
We know it.
Our patients know it.
And we want you to know it.
Naturopathic medicine is the solution that you need to know about. All right, welcome to another episode of That Naturopathic Podcast. This is Dr. Cara.
And this is Dr. Dave.
All right, and today we're joined by Dr. Cyndi Gilbert, and today we're talking about making clinical practice and healthcare more inclusive. She's got a great course coming up called Queering Wellness, and another one for health practitioners called Primary Care for Naturopathic Doctors. And we're really excited to open up this conversation today. Dr. Dave, do you want to more formally introduce Dr. Cyndi?
Yeah, sure.
Okay.
So Dr. Cyndi Gilbert ND is a naturopathic doctor, author, and faculty member at the Canadian College of Naturopathic Medicine, where Cara and I went. She has over 12 years of experience working with patients from marginalized and or vulnerable populations, including Indigenous and racialized communities, people who are homeless or street involved, people living with complex mental health issues, people who use drugs, people living with disabilities, 2S, LGBTQIA plus communities. I got that, I think, and people living in poverty. Cyndi also facilitates cultural competency training for NDs, as well as providing curriculum and policy guidance to naturopathic doctors and private clinics. So super inclusive. We're going to learn about the alphabet soup today.
You love all the peoples, Cyndi.
I work with all the peoples. Thanks so much for having me on. And I'm so glad, Dr. Dave, you spelt out the alphabet soup properly. And so I think it's like probably the best place for us to start is to go through what all of that means.
I think so, because we were chatting a little bit before pressing the record button that, I think a lot of people are, want to learn or have great intentions and maybe just don't know where to start. So who better to kind of walk us through that alphabet than kind of just starting with the basics?
Yeah. And I think it, like you said, it's really important right from the get-go for us to talk about like how, it's easy if you're embedded in this work like I am, and you've been doing it for a really long time. And it's still easy for us to make mistakes and for us to learn. And so if you're someone who is, like, hey, I want to be more inclusive, I want to, be able to live my life in a way that includes everybody or as many people as possible, but I don't know how to do it. And I don't have all the language, I don't have all the tools, and I don't have the experience, that it's so critical to remember that you're going to make mistakes just like we do in life all the time. And you can kind of apply ideas around growth mindset to how you approach this topic as well, so that, you take the shame and blame away from when you make a mistake and you just kind of grow and learn. And it's a continual practice, kind of like naturopathic medicine is for me. And I'm sure you can speak to that as well.
Sure.
So, from the get-go, just take away all of the stress and all of the kind of doubt that you might have about your ability to do it. And we can get into the alphabet soup.
I think that's actually really refreshing or helpful even for me to hear. And I just flashbacks to, when earlier this year with the Black Lives Matter movement. And I'm like, I really want to show up here. I want to learn, and I want to kind of show this, on my social media platforms. But I was actually terrified. I'm like, I'm going to use the wrong hashtag or say the wrong thing. And it's really, it just parallels that a little bit. So I appreciate you saying that, because you're right. We all, if we can show up in a spirit of learning and growth, then we're all going to move forward better.
Yeah, it always reminds me, I had this patient kind of, I don't know how many, like we're talking like probably 10 years ago now, who came into my office and was there for like the first visit. And on my intake forms, forever kind of, I've had spaces or blank spots on my intake forms for assigned sex and gender. And this patient, she came in and she was filling out the intake form in the office, in the waiting room. And she was, in her later 60s. And she turned to me and she said, I see that you have both sex and gender here. And as a teacher of English, I know that they aren't quite the same thing, but I'm still not 100% clear on the difference or how I should fill this out. And, that's the kind of approach to learning that you were talking about, where it's just, I don't know what the difference is, or I don't have all the answers, but I'm curious and I want to learn. From my side of things, I've learned a lot through this process from my patients, because I used to use things on my intake forms that said preferred pronoun. And, I still see that in a lot of practices. Mm-hmm. And then, one day, this, again, is like several years ago now, but one day one of my clients came in and said, it's not my preferred pronoun. It just is my pronoun. For me, I used she, her pronouns, and that patient used they, them pronouns, or uses, they still do. But it was a really important point, because it's not a preference. It just is the pronoun that I use, or that you use, or that Dr. Dave uses. And so, we can kind of think through it and just be open to change. And we're open to our minds being expanded to do things a bit differently.
I mean, I have a preferred shoe size, but I have a shoe size that is not my, so that's a good observation. Let's go to the alphabet.
Well, we'll get to the alphabet in a sec, but it's just stuff we take for granted, right? That's why it's like, I don't think it's preferred. I live, I guess, a very conventional sort of existence where I haven't had to think of it even like that, right? So maybe that's part of where that comes from. Yeah.
And I think, and we're going to come back to this, right? It's like that some of the things that we take for granted, or we make assumptions about, whether that's just like as human beings moving through the world, if you're cisgender, and where your gender and your sex are, the gender you identify with is aligned with the sex that you were assigned when you were born, we make these assumptions. We, go about our lives assuming that other people think that way. And the same thing does apply to kind of, race along Black Lives Matter. And I think there's a lot of parallels between stuff we're going to talk about today and issues of racism or ableism. And the ways that those intersect for people, can often highlight these things. But, it's those small things. We were kind of talking about this before we hit record too, was, those, what are the, some of the small things that people experience who, may perceive or may experience as discrimination, and that are events of discrimination or stigma that they face, that, some of us, especially if we're cisgender and straight, may not even consider, right? Or ever have to experience. I think about every time, where like a lesbian couple with a kid is asked, oh, which one of you is the mom? And, that those things are never asked of someone who's in a different kind of family arrangement. It's those questions that come from a place of curiosity, but and maybe aren't intended as harm, but have the impact of erasing somebody's or making invisible or pathologizing, making it seem like it's abnormal. And, that creates stress. Of course it does, right? If you walk through the world and somebody asks you a question that's like, the classic is like, oh, where are you from? Right. On the race front. It's a similar kind of questioning, or, that makes you feel excluded. And that's going to have an impact on your mental health, on your physical health, and, is part of like how you interact with space with other people.
For sure. So should we,
Alphabet?
we got a little off track because we
We
said we were going
totally,
to start
yeah.
with something that we didn't start with, but let's circle back to that. And I think that was actually, I think that gives some good depth and background ideas or things for people to think about. So yeah, let's back up to our original idea.
Good call. So let's go back through the alphabet. Dave, I always put now, I haven't always done this, but I've switched to putting 2S at the beginning of the acronym because just to acknowledge the importance of the Two-Spirit people. So 2S stands for Two-Spirit. And Two-Spirit is a term that comes from in Indigenous North American communities. And so again, to me, this is about putting forward this idea of, the intersection of how racism can impact ideas around gender and sexual orientation as well. So, Two-Spirit is a term that doesn't fit within any of the other pieces of the alphabet soup. It's specific to Indigenous communities and isn't as well defined maybe in some ways as others because it may include variations on gender identity and expression as well as sexual orientation that are specific to Indigenous communities. And as a non-Indigenous settler person, I can't speak to all of the variations of that, but most Indigenous North American communities do have a history of having, more than just this binary ideas of gender or of sexual orientation. And so Two-Spirit is a term that can encompass those. So then we have kind of the traditional piece that I think most people at this point are familiar with is like LGBT. So L for lesbian and G for gay, usually referring to men, but sometimes includes, other people of other genders as well, depending on how these words have been used by people. T for trans, and transgender is the opposite. I used that term cisgender before, where someone's like sex that they're assigned at birth is consistent with their gender identity, whereas trans, these are like it's like for the chemistry geeks amongst us, it means like on the opposite side, right? If you think about the arrangement of atoms. But so that's where the trans prefix comes from. So it is for folks who may have been assigned one gender or sex at birth, but that does not align or is opposite from the gender identity that they have and or the gender expression that they wish to present with. And sometimes trans includes like a bigger umbrella of folks, including people, who are kind of more gender diverse overall. So people who may identify as non-binary, so neither masculine or feminine in gender, that they may, use words like gender queer, where they shift between genders, or they feel like they're agender, so they do not see themselves as having a gender at all. And gender is something that identity is like that piece of how we think about ourselves. So I think that's important to talk about. So that trans term is, really like almost an umbrella term and a specific term. And that's consistent with most of the alphabet. If we had all the specific terms, which I include in my like Querying for Wellness course, I have like a handout on all the possible terms that people use. And I'm sure it's like, I think it's 6 pages right now and probably could be longer.
Is that what the plus is for?
That is what the plus is for.
And it's to acknowledge that these letters are not inclusive.
All sorts of other options. Yeah, they're still not necessarily going to capture the true variety of and diversity of human experience across these spectrums. So where are we at? We did T.
You missed B though.
Oh, I did miss B. Thank you. See, this is what happens when I don't have it right in front of me. So B is generally for bisexual. So bisexual refers to more about sexual orientation, so who am I like romantically or intimately or sexually attracted to? And, bisexual is a term that usually is associated with somebody who's attracted to more than one gender. romantically or sexually. There's other kind of newer terms like pangender, which, acknowledges that there's not this like binary gender. So that person might be attracted to people of all genders. So that would include folks under that trans umbrella.
Can we just pause and go back to your woman with the intake form? Can you just plainly explain the difference between, because you've mentioned gender and sex a couple times. So can you just go over those two terms as well?
Oh, like such a great plan. Yeah, just the basics of the difference between sex and gender. Yeah, so sex is like, it is I always explain it that like sex is the thing that, people talk about when a baby is born. And actually that's how sex is assigned. That's the term that we use as assigned, is like, it's like a check mark on somebody's box, right? And literally we do that all the time. We check boxes. And so sex is when we talk about it, we kind of get confused sometimes because we're not sure what we're talking about. Sex can be really complicated. It's biological sex, but there's, does that mean like our chromosomes? Is that the XY versus XX chromosomes? But then that doesn't include people who have all sorts of other chromosomal variations like XXY. But that could be, what kinds of hormones our bodies produce, once we hit puberty. But really, sex is like a doctor or whoever, like the person attending the birth, maybe it's a midwife, literally picks up a baby, looks at the baby's genitals, and makes a call. And that's really like how we define what sex you are, or how your sex is defined, how my sex is defined, is literally somebody picked up a baby and said, it's a...
Right. Yeah.
It's a baby. Yes. But usually somebody's going to say it's a girl or a boy. And that's entirely based on the appearance of genitals. So really, like when we talk about sex, we're really talking about genital appearance. So, does this baby's, do their genitals look like a penis, or does it look like a vulva? And, when doctors aren't sure what they're looking at, when the baby is born, then, that kid might get deemed intersex. And there's a whole bunch of history and around that. But so that would be somebody who doesn't neatly fit into those boxes, usually based on genital appearance. And so then, then they might go into like, what chromosomes does the person have? What hormones are they likely to produce? What organs do they have in their body? Like on the inside of their body, not just their genitals. Like, do they have testes, or do they have a uterus? Do they have ovaries? And that's, kind of a more complicated way of talking about sex. But really, sex is simple.
And that sounds so basic, but I think a lot of people listening would have had no idea that the way things look might not match chromosomes, or that there's more chromosomes than just the two that we think of as male and female. So I like even that.
Oh, for sure.
Is like the awesome pot of soup that we're in life, right?
Yeah. And like the amazingness of humanity. Like we don't really talk about that. And I mean, I don't know about, we all kind of went to naturopathic school, relatively around the same time, but it wasn't really something that we talked about through our education, and certainly wasn't something that I learned before that either. But the data we do have, and like what the statistics say, is that somewhere between 1% and 2% of people don't actually fit neatly into those male and female boxes on those check marks, and that's not it's a small amount of people, but it's also a pretty significant number of people who aren't gonna.
From a practitioner point of view, that's, if I see 1,000 people a year, or depending on the populations you're working with. I think do we have any letters left, Dave?
Well, I just want to say I already learned something from that, because I was, when you talked about assigned gender, I was like, well, doesn't she mean biological? But then I didn't want to, offend or look really stupid. Maybe I do anyway, but biological, I just saw it as like, oh, biological sex, that's like a thing. But then I forgot, we do learn in school about like XXY and, the different sort of even biological genders that we know are out there. Because I know some people struggle with that. Is it biological? But this idea of being assigned a gender based on like genital appearance is, I've never heard it boiled down to that. So I find that insightful already.
I'm thinking back to my 20-week ultrasound, and they're like, "There's the hamburger sign. It's a girl."
Oh, exactly. Right. It's, I mean, so yeah, not actually when the baby's born nowadays. It's actually like on the
20
ultrasound
weeks.
at 20
You're
weeks.
determined.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Or for some folks, actually, they're getting like the early pregnancy tests that actually look at chromosomes because they're testing for other things. And they may actually get a chromosomal sex, which is different from the hamburger sign on an ultrasound and may not always match up. And that's, I think the kind of amazing, the amazing thing is that there isn't, it's not as simple as XY or XX, and there's a lot more variability there in human existence that we don't often talk about. And so, it's not a stupid question at all. It's just, that the more we have these conversations, the more we, understand and can think through like, oh, what if, somebody did have that experience? Like, what if, they had parents who had that 20-week ultrasound and the doctor was like, yeah, you're having a girl. But in the end, that baby, reached puberty and didn't actually make estrogen and progesterone in the ways that we think that somebody would who'd been raised as a girl. And, what does that mean for that person? And how, how is that teenager going to be in the world? What their experience is.
Cyndi, this is like, I mean, I love having conversations because it often applies to other topics. And Dave and I always talk about how the world doesn't like things that are not black or white, right? Like we like, it's simple and safe to have something, that's this or that. Like I'm mask or anti-mask, I'm vaccine or anti-vaccine, because all of the gray stuff in the middle is scary and unknown. And so our brains, I think, naturally are like, it's this or that. And I think it's great to have conversations like this because we need to be comfortable understanding that that's not how we're built or how life is.
Yeah. I mean, we want to put definitions around things. We want to have an alphabet soup, right? Like, because we want to be able to, like be able to create definitions of things and say like, this is this thing and this is something else. And, the world just doesn't fit neatly always into boxes. And so, there is a lot more nuance to it. And that's, that's why there's like terms that mean more than one thing, or there's like a lot of terms, or there's a lot of nuance between terms, especially when we're talking about like how we see ourselves in the world, or, how we think about our sexuality and our sexual orientation.
Well, speaking of nuance and words that mean many different things, can you tell me about the G in the soup? Because is that what we're at? No, Q.
I think we're at
Q in the soup.
We're at the last, yeah.
Yeah, because Q
we're
to
at the
me.
Z of the.
Yeah. The Q to me has been like, as a not very educated person in this realm, the Q to me has always been an interesting one. Can you maybe teach us a bit about the different meanings behind that?
Sure. I mean, so queer, the Q usually stands for queer. And, queer was a word historically that was used like almost like a slur or was used as a slur. Many of these words have been, and there's lots of other slurs for people in this area. But it's a word that, kind of got reappropriated by folks within the alphabet soup to say, I'm going to wear this as a badge of strength and resiliency. And it's also a word that, is much more, less defined, right? It's a word that I use. If you look at my bio, I use it often to kind of identify myself as queer in some ways. And for me, that part of that is that I feel like I was raised in queer community. I grew up in queer community. My mother identifies as a lesbian. And I use that word in that way, but it also, there's this word that didn't exist when I was growing up because there were like very few kids of of queer couples. See there, I'm going to use it now. When I was growing up in the 80s and early 90s, and or at least where I was in like the suburbs of Ottawa. But there's a word that I learned, that is used nowadays because there's a lot more kids growing up with queer parents, called queer spawn, right? So it's like children of parents who identify as like LGBTQ2S. And so that, again, that's a different way that this word can be used. It literally means like odd or different. And so, it's a way of saying like, that you don't fit neatly into those boxes. So it is like the most nuanced term of all, as you pointed out, Dave.
And the most inclusive, right?
And the most
like
inclusive.
It covers all of the soup.
Yeah. It's the one I turn to when I don't want to use the whole acronym. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. How about we shift this conversation?
We have more letters.
Oh, we have more letters?
Mm-hmm.
We have 2 more letters, I think. I is for intersex, which I already used.
Wow,
and then,
see, I thought we were at the end. Okay.
No. And then A is, either for like asexual, aromantic, folks who don't identify as having a sexual orientation or being interested in sex or in romance, but also could be a gender not having a gender. So or androgynous, or all sorts of other words that start with A. Now we're really officially at the end.
Okay. The A is at the end of the alphabet. So
yeah, just because we're not into ticking boxes, we can also move backwards in the alphabet.
Yeah, I like it. Can we move this conversation a bit into how this shows up in healthcare and wellness and medicine in general? Whether we're talking about wellness or naturopathic medicine or just healthcare in general, how does this show up? Like, can you give some examples of where some bias might come in, or lack of medical kind of training might come in? Where does this show up?
For sure. I mean, I think the most like obvious examples often, come from situations where, somebody shows up in a waiting room and they're like going for a PAP or like a pelvic exam, and they have, a gender presentation. So that is that like people assume based on how they look or how they hold their body or their tone of voice that person is a man. And, maybe they are a trans man, but who still has a cervix and a uterus, and they are going for a PAP exam, but other people in the waiting room are uncomfortable or wondering why there's a man there, or staff aren't sure why that person is there. And there's lots of, I think, of opportunities for people to feel like they're excluded or that they're in the wrong place. Right. And I think that the same thing can happen often if you think about like folks undergoing fertility treatments where, they're going to get testing done as a couple, but they're 2 women or 2 men. And how included or excluded do they feel in that waiting room or in that office? And that really starts like oftentimes for people, there's a barrier set up from the get-go because they're going to an office and say they're trying to get healthcare for their kid or for themselves, and they're filling out forms, and the forms say, mom and dad. And, right then and there, they're faced with this obvious sense that they're not included, that they don't exist. And in the same way that other couples might exist, or other parents exist, or other guardians exist. And so, it's harmful because it almost like it erases their existence and tells them that there's something wrong with them, which, I think is the hardest piece when they're, interacting at that first step with a healthcare situation. Or, I think the other times when it comes up is these little things, right? So, maybe they're in the office and they're talking about their partner, and, they're like, oh, my partner is really supportive. And the doctor makes an assumption about their partner and, uses a pronoun say it's a man in the office and he's talking about his partner, and the doctor says, oh, what does she do for a living? Or, that's great. I'm glad to know that you have her support. And that person then, maybe their partner, if their partner uses he, him pronouns or is a man, that person now has to, correct their doctor. Right. So they're in a position where they have to say, actually, my partner or my husband or, whatever it is that they are needing to make a correction. And again, it ruins that therapeutic relationship a little bit. And it's those kind of small things, people call them microaggressions, those small bits of ways that people can get erased or be harmed. And so those are some of the kind of very basic barriers that get set up. Sometimes, doctors and naturopaths and other wellness providers, they just may not have the knowledge, or they worry that they don't have the knowledge and the ability to treat people who, are queer identified. And so that, sets up a small thing where the doctor is nervous or lacks confidence. And that could be something that the other person picks up on and is am I getting treated this way because I'm being discriminated against for who I am? So that's the kind of, the smaller pieces. But the reality is that, we also know from lots of healthcare data that we have that people don't get the care that they should, that, they may not get all the screening exams that they should. I've had lots of, it happens less and less, but it still happens where I might have a woman in my office who only has sex with other women or has only, in technical terms, vaginal contacts, in terms of sex practices. And so that, and then she says, well, nobody's ever suggested I get a pap test done. And that's just incorrect information, right? And so it's unfortunate, but true that lesbians and bisexual women tend to get fewer mammograms and get fewer pap tests done because their doctors aren't aware of how to approach it with them or what the guidelines really are, or they're afraid to ask those questions in a healthcare setting. Right. Sometimes, this is kind of true across the board. So there's lots of different ways that these kinds of walls get put up that stop people from getting the healthcare that they need.
And if that situation arises over and over in a lifetime, that's going to create massive health outcomes or worse health outcomes.
Absolutely. If it happens to you once, then that's one thing. But if it happens to you over and over again, then you might be afraid to go into those offices. Or if, you go into a place and you're sitting in the waiting room and another client is making homophobic jokes or remarks or transphobic jokes and remarks or racist jokes and remarks, how are you going to feel comfortable going back into that space the next time that you need to make an appointment? And so, people delay getting care because they've had too many of those experiences, or they have lost trust in the medical system. And, we see that in other kinds of situations as well.
Yeah, there's other situations I was just thinking of too that maybe some other people could relate to, like step parents or parents of a child who it's not their biological child, and you show up or whatever, and they're like, oh, and you must be the dad or you must be the mom, and it's like, well, no, and maybe some people can relate that way because it is that same feeling of like, oh, shit, I know you're not trying to offend or anything, but it's not true, and I don't want the child to hear that, or because it's not true. I'm not. So yeah, maybe some people could relate that way. But one thing I want to talk about, Cyndi, was that situation where maybe someone who's queer, let's just say, can I say queer as sort of the most encompassing of the terms, or alphabet soup, go to the doctor, and the doctor or the reception makes some sort of assumption which is based on only norms and probability. It's not really trying to be anything out of line. It's just, so there's a situation there where they say something that doesn't apply to this person because their gender or what have you is not what is assumed. How do both parties react to that gracefully from both ends. So how does the queer person react to make it as easy as possible for the relationship to be okay or start on the right foot? And how does the practitioner or receptionist or whoever react to make it to make it as good as possible at that point?
For sure. I mean, I think, I think it's really important to address both sides of that equation. But of course, I'm going to say that the onus is really on the doctor or the receptionist or the clinic owner to train their staff so that those mistakes happen less often. And there's lots of simple ways to get around that. I think, a good example is that somebody makes an assumption that somebody is a woman when really they're a man. And maybe they use the wrong pronoun in that instance, or they ask about using the washroom and they're directed to the wrong washroom. Mm-hmm. There's very simple fixes from a training staff perspective, and it's one of the things that I work on with clinic owners is training reception to always provide all the info. So say it's a washroom and the person's like, hey, where's the washroom? And instead of making the assumption that this person wants a women's washroom or this person wants a men's washroom, the staff person can say the women's washroom is down the hall to the left, the men's washroom is the third door on the right, and hopefully, and we have a gender neutral washroom, over on the left hand side, so that you give all of the options and include everybody in your response. Or that you train staff to or use intake forms that to incorrect pronouns being used when talking about, say, a patient's in the waiting room and the reception wants to tell the doctor or the practitioner, that, oh, so-and-so is here. Well, we could say, oh, Kara's here, they're in the waiting room. And so that you're always using a neutral pronoun if you don't know what it is. I think, when those mistakes happen, just getting back to your real question, which is, when those mistakes happen, I think, if someone feels comfortable in that moment, the queer identified person to make a correction, or if there's some other time when they can do it, if they don't feel comfortable in that moment, which I think, if it's happened over and over again, that might not be, feel safe for them. And so, if they can indicate in some way, even in the moment or after the fact, hey, when this happened, I felt hurt, so that, people realize what they're doing, because, most of the time people don't intend to cause harm to other people. We generally, are good people who are well-intentioned and want to be inclusive. And so, just sending a little note, whether it's after the fact or in the moment, to that person can make a big change in the way somebody interacts in the future. And then for the person who's made an error, say you've misgendered or someone, you've used the wrong name or the wrong pronoun or made an assumption about their gender, that, apologizing but not really dwelling on it too much can be really important, so that you apologize, you offer to do better next time, let the person know you're going to work on it, actually do that work and follow through on it, but then also, not spend a whole bunch of time, talking about how horrible you feel about it, because then you've really centered your own experience in that moment. So, if I'm like, oh my gosh, I'm so sorry, I can't believe that I did that, I've been working so hard, I hate it when I do that. And then, it almost feels like the person that you have hurt, however unintentionally, is going to try and, provide you with empathy and care. And it really should be the reverse. So I think it's just, taking the approach of hey, I'm so sorry that I said that wrong. I'm working on it, and then move on, so that you have acknowledged that you made the error, but you aren't making it about you in that moment, right, and your feelings. Okay.
So where should we go next? I'm curious. Can you think of other ways that this does show up, in healthcare? And I'm curious, just your perspective for naturopathic medicine in general, because our medicine is individualized medicine. That's our core tenet. And so, we treat people, we don't treat diseases. We treat people. Right. And I love that about our medicine. Can you talk just specifically about naturopathic medicine and how, maybe we're doing well or where we have growth or learning to evolve?
For sure. I mean, I think, there's always room to grow for everybody. Otherwise, we wouldn't call it practice.
Exactly.
But, I think you're absolutely correct, like in the sense that, we do, work with people on an individual level, and like there is no right or wrong way to go about things. We're really focused from a professional philosophy on like, having the patient at the center of their care and letting them, and helping them to be more empowered and provide them with information and let them make their own kind of informed choices about how they're going to approach their health and what treatment options they want to draw from. And so that, is a natural fit, I think, for folks who are queer identified, because there's less rigidity in terms of, boxes to fit into.
Right.
I think there is always room to grow, but the other piece about naturopathic medicine is that we're really focused on the prevention side of things. So, we always talk about like, how do we prevent people? How do we, prevent ill health or prevent disease, as opposed to always constantly thinking about treating a pathology or treating something that already is there. And that, brings the focus on like really like building strength and building confidence, building skill sets, and building resiliency in managing life and stressors so that you prevent disease. And that's really in line with like most of the research. We talked about all those barriers to health for folks who are in the alphabet soup, and that's all of us really, in some way or another. And so, that if we're talking about prevention, we talk about, what are the things that help protect us from getting sick. And when we look at those research, you can look at the research on lesbians and gays and bisexuals and trans folks, and you'll see that like on the surface, you'll see all this evidence and all this research that says, they're more likely to suffer from depression, or they're more likely to suffer from anxiety. They're more likely to have addictions to different kinds of like substances, or they're more likely to smoke cigarettes. They're more likely to think about suicide or attempt suicide. And those are like really, valid stats, but they only tell us part of the story. They only tell us about like what the endpoint is and not about the prevention side of things. And if we look at those whole picture, the other piece of the research is that when people feel supported and they feel included and they have, families that support them, or they have friends that support them, or they have chosen family that supports them, like non-biological chosen family, that they're less likely to have all those other risks and all those other conditions that I just listed. And
which,
so
that's a huge point you're making. So what you're saying is
massive.
So those risk factors are not inherent to the identity. They're inherent to the discrimination that comes as a result of it.
Exactly. Yeah. So it's not about being queer identified that puts you at risk. It's actually about your experience of stigma and discrimination and even violence in the world that puts you at risk for those things. It's not, being 2S LGBTQIA+. It's actually about homophobia, transphobia, and, that those are the pieces that actually are going to have that impact and harm you from a health perspective. And so it's huge, I think, for like anyone who's, maybe you're like someone listening and you're like, well, I don't really fit into the alphabet in any kind of way that we've really talked about, other than maybe as like straight or heterosexual. And I'm cisgender, so I don't really like relate to any of these experiences. The reality is that there's probably somebody in your life who can, and providing that person with support and letting them be the person that they are is the thing that's going to prevent them from facing any of those risks more than anything else that we know about.
I mean, it totally makes sense, because all primates are social animals and they want to be part of the group. And if you don't feel part of the group for whatever reason, like if you're alone as a primate in the jungle, you will die, right? So it's I think it's really ingrained to be to feel included in the group, which leads me to ask about what kind of language can we use? Like just everyone use to help the environment in which sort of less conventional combinations of gender and sex exist? Like, how can we change our language in a way that makes it a little more comfy? Because language is really important.
Yeah. I mean, there's a ton of ways to do this. And if folks want, I created a handout with one of my students a couple of years ago on neutralizing your language. You can't always make it 100% neutral, but like neutralizing your language. So it's like actually a table of like, instead of this word, try and use these words. My favorite example from that, and people can go to my website and sign up to get a copy of that at any time. But the easiest thing I think is like, I'm a big fan of using the word y'all. I'm not from the South of the US, but
oh my.
I want to like bring it back into like just like regular language, even in Canada, that like this is a word that we can use. Like we can use everyone, but we could also use y'all to describe people instead of saying like, hey guys, which I still do all the time.
Yeah.
Or if you want to be more formal, using like ladies and gentlemen. Well, that we know, we've already talked about this. It doesn't include everybody. And right. So that's my rationale for the use of the word y'all. I think
y'all.
That's
you need a button.
You need a button.
You need it on a button. Hey y'all.
Hey y'all. Or, hi everyone. So that, sure. That's the easiest way. I think there's so many, other things that I've used even when we've been talking about pelvic exams instead of using the word gynecological, so that you're right. focused on the anatomy of the body instead of on a word that has gender associated with it, sure. so that you can include everybody.
Or partner. I think more people are used to using the word partner instead of, your husband or your girlfriend or your wife. That
my kids invented a word because I asked about this. They're like in that they're tweeny, early teens. And I was like, what do you call, because this is a word that I was, couldn't find anyone. Like, what do you call someone who's not a partner? Because partner kind of has like a seriousness to the relationship piece.
Sure.
For some people, that, is like somebody that maybe you have a crush on if you're like a young teen. This is like, cause I, sometimes work with younger kids in my practice who, don't fit neatly into boxes. And I was like, well, what do you call somebody that you have a crush on, but like maybe isn't your like, you don't want to use the word special friend, or like, like what's the cool word? And my two kids were like, you should call that person your roamie. It's like a romantic, interest, but it's a neutral way to talk about it. So it's not really like identifying the gender of the person. It's like partner, but like less serious.
Yeah. The kids always have good lingo.
Yeah, exactly. The kids will set us straight.
For
or
sure.
Queer, as the case may be.
Yes. Actually, well, there's a term right there, right? I'm curious. So I have a women's health focus, and like that is my specialty in my clinic. Can you give me some ideas of where I might not have thought I'm not being inclusive, or that, right? Because can you give me some ideas on, because I'm sure that I am making mistakes.
For sure. I mean, I think, one thing I've noticed that a lot of people who like focus on women's health, is using the X instead of the vowel. And, we see that even in talking about Latinx, like people who are Latinx, so that you're not implying a gender when you're talking about that term would include trans women in your practice. It's a way of indicating that you treat, sort of women's health, but also trans women's health, or non-binary women's health, would all be kind of included in that. And then I think it is
more and more actually, which is,
I'm seeing it. I'm seeing it a lot more recently, and I think people are thinking about how do I indicate to people that my practice is safe, or my clinic is safe for them to come visit. And I think that those outward facing materials and using different words help with that. And then really like talking about, instead of talking about, you can talk about hormones or endogenous hormones. Those are the hormones that your body makes, as well as, exogenous hormones, or hormones that we may be prescribed or take on the outside, that we have to like put into our bodies or onto our bodies,
Right.
in order to kind of achieve a certain level of hormones or a certain piece around our health. And then, using words like pelvic exam instead of gynecological exam. I think there's ways of talking about puberty that, can be like most people's bodies who have a uterus and ovaries will produce estrogen as part of and estrogen and progesterone in greater amounts during puberty, that like leads to, breast development. Some folks are more comfortable with the word chest over breast. And part of it is just asking people, like, what do you call that part of your body? Or what are the words that you use, right? Like, we could use really, like, as we do often in medicine, like really technical terms. And then somebody will be like, oh, I don't know what that is that you're talking about. I'm trying to think of a good example that's like not even gendered, but like, oh yeah, like collarbones, right? So if you use like the proper anatomical term for it, like a lot of people would be like, I have no idea what you're talking about. And so some of it is like, it's just education and using the words that your patient uses and mirroring their language. I think those are, some of the biggest things. Mm-hmm. And then, if you're a fertility-based practitioner, then you can think about ways that you talk about fertility or talk about hormones. Don't always make the assumption that you're a person who ovulates, or that you have a partner. There's that word again. You have a partner at all, or that you have a partner who produces sperm in their body as like an assumption.
How do you, so I'm like, I have devil's advocate brain all the time, so you have to forgive me. But so when you do something like, you're saying the women, so WOMXN, how
Yes.
do you communicate that? So this is maybe it's a weird question, but that's how my brain works. How do you communicate to those who maybe are just like conventional? They see that, they go, what is that? So how do you actually remain inclusive to people who are, not as into the I don't know, they don't understand the alphabet soup as much. Like, how do you not risk losing communicating with sort of normal cisgendered people? Do you write both, or how do you communicate that?
Yeah, I mean, there's different ways, and I think like each practitioner kind of would know, or if you're like writing to a group of friends or like a book club or whatever, or any kind of situation where you're using that word, you can approach it in two ways. Like if people are familiar with the X, you can use the X in written. You can even put an asterisk so that you explain what you mean by that. Or you can use the word woman with an A, but then write exactly in brackets, like, what do you mean by that? So, this is something that, we see, we're working on some signage for a clinic where they actually had a gym, and they wanted women's only hours for women who, for religious reasons, didn't want to be in the same space working out and wearing workout clothes as men. And so we use the word woman without the X, but in brackets just put, that the women includes cis women, trans women, non-binary women. And so that you're using words that are both familiar and you can use social media, and you use your other ways of explaining what you mean so that you can clarify it for all people. And I think, that's an important piece is acknowledging that not everybody has the same language or has all the same, understands all the letters in the alphabet. And so how do we make space for everybody in that way?
And you're clarifying it, and then you're creating awareness to somebody who might not understand that there are other ways that word might be interpreted. So yeah, it's a good.
It goes back to my 60-something-year-old patient who was filling out the form and was like, I know that there's a difference between these, but I'm not exactly sure what it is. And it was an opportunity for me to talk to her about that too, right? So I was like, oh, for some of my this is the difference, and for some people in my practice who see me, they're not the same, right? And, I've had people not understand how to fill that out. And then it's a conversation too. I think, it's important too for most of us who are cisgender or who are heterosexual walk around the world in a way where we don't ever have to explain those things, or we don't have to think about them. And, it's okay. It may not be comfortable, and it may put us in a position where we have to ask, what does this mean? I'm not familiar with this. But it's okay to be uncomfortable or to not know. And it really normalizes, I think, asking questions and not feeling stupid when you ask a question, and that, we're all just trying to understand each other better and be better people.
Mm-hmm. I think that's a great segue into, we always ask our guests at the end or closing of the conversation, what's one thing you would like our listeners to leave with after our chat today?
Y'all listen up.
Yeah. Yes.
It's got to start with, okay, y'all.
Yeah, it has to start with, okay, y'all. I mean, if it weren't for us talking about y'all over and over again, then I would say that that's the one thing. But I think, if there's one thing I can ask people to do is to just think about all those times, how often do they see themselves represented in posters or in media or on television? And how often are some of the people we talked about today who may fit in different spots in that alphabet, how much do they really know about those other parts of the alphabet? And work on empathy, right? So that we all have compassion for each other. We're we're also in the middle of a pandemic, and it's hard times for a lot of people for lots of different reasons. And if there's one thing I think that y'all, including myself, can have is compassion for ourselves and compassion for others.
Yes. And just as you mentioned, the pandemic, that almost highlights the need to understand that we all have different experiences, right? We're all in this world together, or in this pandemic together, and we all have different experiences and thoughts and fears and anxieties and good things and bad things that have come out of it. And it's okay that someone else has it. It's almost kind of put a spotlight on, we're all here, we're all human, and we're all experiencing it a little differently. Yeah. And
it's okay to be different. We're not all the same. And in fact, we're probably more different than we think we are. And we're also more the same than we usually think we are.
Yes. Yeah. Okay. So Doc, can you direct us to some of the awesome things that you're doing?
Yeah. I am, definitely have lots of resources on my website, which is cindygilbert.ca, cyndigilbert.ca. And from there's that link to that neutralizing language document that I talked about. There's also links to the courses that you talked about at the beginning. So I've got that course on trans primary care for naturopathic doctors or for other regulated health professionals. So you don't have to be a naturopathic doctor to take the course. But there's that course, and then I have a course that's coming up really soon on queering wellness, which is more in line with what we were talking about today. Is more ideas on how to include more people in a wellness practice or in your life in general, and tips in terms of language, in terms of intake forms, in terms of how to set up the clinic, and really getting much deeper into the things we talked about today.
Awesome. Any final thoughts, Dr. Dave?
No, that was great. Sometime I'd love to talk to Cyndi about income equality and treating the underserviced people who have low income, but we can talk about that another time. This was like chock block full of good stuff. So maybe we'll line you up for another talk sometime.
That sounds great.
Okay.
That's, my other big passion. Yeah, other than forest bathing, obviously.
So we just had a great episode that touched on that quite a bit. So,
awesome.
All right. Thanks for joining us
Yeah,
today.
thank you so much, Cyndi. That was super enlightening.
Thanks. I hope it went like in flow, but still kept us on track and was everything that you hoped it would be.
That's great.